In the summer of 1314, what was likely the largest English army to ever cross the border marched into Scotland. It was an immense force, with some estimates putting it as high as 13,000 to possibly 20,000 soldiers strong, including around 3,000 of Europe's most feared warriors, the heavily armored English knight. Waiting for them stood a Scottish army of just 6,000 to 7,000 or so men. By all accounts, it should have been a slaughter, but their king, Robert the Bruce, had a secret weapon. Not some new type of sword or bow, but the land itself. This is the story of how a small, determined army turned a battlefield into a death trap and won one of the most stunning underdog victories in history. So why was this battle such a massive deal? To get that, we need to rewind. For years, Scotland had been locked in a brutal struggle known as the First War of Scottish Independence. Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scots in 1306, but his reign kicked off with disaster. He was an outlaw king, hunted by enemies both English and Scottish. But through sheer grit and brilliant guerrilla tactics, Bruce clawed his way back, taking castle after castle from their English garrisons. By 1314, only a handful of strongholds were still in English hands. The most critical was Stirling Castle, the gateway to the Scottish Highlands. Bruce's brother, Edward, had it under siege. In a pact that would seal the fate of two kingdoms, the English governor promised to surrender if an army didn't relieve him by Midsummer's Day, June 24th. This was a challenge King Edward II of England couldn't possibly ignore. To back down would be a catastrophic humiliation. So, he gathered his great host. While estimates vary, the English force was gigantic, numbering somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 men, with a core of up to 3,000 heavy cavalry, the medieval equivalent of battle tanks. They were professional, battle-hardened, and utterly confident. Against them, Robert the Bruce could gather maybe 6,000 to 7,000 men, mostly infantry armed with long pikes, several hundred light horse, and very few archers. On paper, this was a mismatch of epic proportions, but Bruce had a mind forged in the hardships of war. He knew he couldn't face that English juggernaut on an open field, so he chose his ground with masterful care. South of Stirling, the main road snaked through a narrow corridor of land, hemmed in by woods and the marshy banks of a stream called the Bannockburn. This landscape would be his accomplice. The woods would guard his flanks, and the soft, boggy ground would neutralize the greatest English advantage, the thunderous charge of their heavy knights. And he didn't stop there. Accounts say Bruce ordered his men to prepare the battlefield. On the firm ground where the English cavalry would likely charge, they dug countless small, knee-deep pits, camouflaging them with branches. While not all historians agree on this, these were said to be tripwires designed to shatter a cavalry charge and turn a disciplined line of horsemen into a chaotic, stumbling mess. The stage was set. The trap was laid. On June 23, 1314, the English vanguard finally appeared. As two formations of cavalry advanced towards Stirling, a moment of pure medieval drama unfolded, one that would become the stuff of legend. Robert the Bruce was at the front, watching the enemy. He wasn't on a mighty warhorse, but a smaller, nimble palfrey, armed only with a battle axe. Spotting the Scottish king, an English knight named Sir Henry de Bohun saw his chance for immortal glory. A nephew of an earl, he was the very picture of chivalric might, clad in steel and wielding a heavy lance. Seeing Bruce so lightly equipped, de Bohun lowered his lance and charged. A full-speed charge from a warhorse was almost unstoppable. His men would later scold him for the incredible risk he took. But Bruce didn't flinch. He held his ground. At the last possible second, as the lance was about to hit, He expertly swerved his pony aside. As de Bohun thundered past, Bruce rose in his stirrups. With a single, brutal swing of his axe, he brought it crashing down on the knight's helmet, splitting it and his skull wide open. The psychological impact was immense. The Scottish soldiers erupted in a roar, their morale skyrocketing at the sight of their king's skill and courage. Legend says Bruce's only regret was that he'd broken the shaft of his favorite axe. Spurred on by the Scots surged forward and threw back the English vanguard, who struggled to pull back across the Bannockburn. Elsewhere, another English cavalry force tried to outflank the Scots, but was met by a schiltron, a tight, disciplined formation of infantry, presenting a dense, bristling wall of 12-foot pikes. It was a human hedgehog, a formation that cavalry just couldn't break. The English knights charged again and again, but they couldn't penetrate the forest of spears and were driven off in confusion. The first day belonged to the Scots. The English, frustrated and overconfident, then made a disastrous decision. They moved their main army off the firm road and into the marshy, confined low ground between the Bannockburn and another stream. They were now perfectly, fatally trapped. The English spent a miserable night cramped in a terrible position, their camp a mess of disorganization. Early the next morning, on the decisive day of June 24th, Edward II made his fatal move. He ordered his army to cross the river and attack. As the massive English host began to slowly shift forward, they were stunned to see the entire Scottish army emerge from the woods and advance towards them. This wasn't the defensive fight the English were expecting. Bruce had trained his men to use the schiltrons on offense, a tactic requiring incredible discipline. The Scottish army advanced as one, 4 great battles or divisions moving like mobile walls of spear points, an unstoppable tide of steel. The English army was a tangled mess, packed into a space far too small for their numbers. The vanguard, led by the Earl of Gloucester, charged, but instead of an open field, they were met by a hedge of pikes. The charge was stopped almost dead. Horses were impaled, knights were thrown to the ground, and the momentum was utterly broken. The English knights, who needed space for their devastating charge, were jammed together, unable to fight. Their greatest strength had become their weakness. Panic began to creep in. The English longbowmen, the archers who had destroyed Scottish schiltrons at Falkirk years before, tried to find a place to fire from, but they couldn't get a clear shot. With the two armies locked in a brutal, close-quarters brawl, their arrows were just as likely to hit their own men. Bruce, anticipating this, had held his small force of several hundred light cavalry in reserve. He now unleashed them, and they smashed into the exposed English archers, scattering them completely. The battle raged. The English were being compressed, pushed back toward the burn, their formations crumbling under the relentless pressure from the pikes. And then came the moment that shattered their will to fight. From a hill behind the Scottish lines, a new, noisy force suddenly appeared, waving makeshift banners. To the exhausted and terrified English, it looked like a massive wave of fresh Scottish reinforcements had arrived. This was the final straw. But this was no army. It was the small folk, the camp followers, servants, and baggage handlers who had been watching the battle. Seeing the tide turning, they grabbed whatever they could and charged down the hill, screaming and shouting. While historians debate their true impact, the illusion worked perfectly. Panic exploded into a full-blown rout. The English lines disintegrated. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled. Recognizing the battle was lost, King Edward II's own bodyguards grabbed his reins and dragged him from the field, leading him on a desperate flight back toward England. The escape for the rest of his army was a nightmare. Funneled back towards the streams, they created a horrific bottleneck. Men and horses drowned in the deep water, while others were cut down by the pursuing Scots. The once mighty English army simply fell apart. It was a slaughter. Thousands of English soldiers were killed, and many high-ranking nobles were captured. By comparison, Scottish losses were remarkably light. Bannockburn was more than just a victory. It was a military and political earthquake. In 2 days, Robert the Bruce had annihilated England's power in Scotland and secured his own crown. While the war would officially drag on for another 14 years, the outcome was no longer in doubt. In 1328, England finally signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, formally recognizing Scotland's independence and Robert the Bruce as its rightful king. The battle's impact on warfare was profound. It proved, in the most dramatic way possible, that well-led, disciplined infantry could defeat the supposedly invincible heavy cavalry that had dominated European battlefields. The schiltron, when used with intelligence and courage, was a night killer. Today, the Battle of Bannockburn is remembered as a cornerstone of Scottish national identity, a symbol of resilience, and a testament to the idea that a smaller force, with brilliant leadership and a clever strategy, can overcome impossible odds. In the end, Bannockburn wasn't won with superior weapons or overwhelming numbers. It was won in the mind of Robert the Bruce before the first sword was even drawn. He saw the battlefield not just as a patch of ground, but as a weapon in itself. By using the terrain to neutralize his enemy's greatest strength, preparing his deadly traps, and deploying his disciplined schiltrons with tactical genius, he turned an army of 6,000 to 7,000 into a force that could humble an empire. It's one of history's greatest lessons. Brute force can be broken by strategy, and the will of a people fighting for their freedom is a weapon all its own.